He thought his badge made him untouchable until he brought the wrong woman to court. When she walked into court, she killed his career. He thought she was just another black woman he could scare. Before we go back, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications because I have something very special in store for you tomorrow. That night, the road was almost empty. A few cars went by, and the headlights bounced off the wet road. Long shadows were cast over the highway outside of Birmingham, Alabama, by the flickering streetlights. It was late, almost 11 o'clock, and most people were just eager to get home. It had been almost 2 hours since Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson had last sat behind the wheel. She'd been humming along with the soft beat of an old jazz song playing through the speakers. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She was just wearing a black sweater, pants, and hair pulled back. She thought that... Then she looked back and saw the lights, blue and red, lighting up, moving up on her quickly. She clenched her stomach. She wasn't scared because she knew how things worked, but because they were tired. She made a move, switched lanes, and slowly pulled her car off to the side. It was park time. She took a deep breath and kept both hands out in front of her. She had been in the army for a long time and knew how to do things. Just behind her, a white police car stopped. It took the cop a while to leave. When he did, he moved like a man who wanted to be obeyed. He was walking on the asphalt with his heavy boots, one hand on his belt, and the other carrying a flashlight that turned on as he got closer. She slightly turned her head and looked at him in the side mirror. The light hit the name on his tag, Briggs. Getting a license and signing up, not a greeting, no reason given. His voice was flat, trained, and rushed. Renee looked at himself in the mirror and then slowly reached into the glove box and took out her records. "Officer, was I going too fast?" Her voice was steady as she asked. It took Briggs a while to answer. He grabbed the papers out of her hand and held them just out of reach while he checked out her car. "It's dark outside," he said. She made a face. "That's not possible." Briggs turned his head to look at her. "Are you coming at me?" There was a beat of quiet. Renee could tell that the air was changing, that silent moment when power met resistance, and both sides thought the other would give up. It was something she had seen before, in briefings, on bases abroad, and in training drills that are meant to get sailors ready for life after the Navy. She knew she shouldn't push, but she also knew what she could do. "I was just saying," she said in a calm voice. "A few weeks ago, my headlights were checked, but if something goes wrong, I can fix it. Get out of the car." He cut her off, as if he hadn't heard anything. Renee let out a slow breath. As she looked ahead, she saw cars going fast. No one saw it. First, she tapped the steering wheel once, and then she reached for the door handle. "Could you explain why?" she asked. Briggs cocked his head and smiled. "Since I told you so." This made her think for a second. Then she took off her seatbelt and opened the door. It was cooler at night than she thought it would be. She stepped out onto the sidewalk with a calm but steady gait. She wasn't willing to fight. She wouldn't be picked on, though. Briggs took a step back and looked at her. She could tell he was looking at her to see how much he could get away with. Turn around, get in the car. This time, she thought about it. Why is that? Briggs moved toward her. His smile went away. "Are you fighting back?" Renee didn't give up. "Not at all. I want to ask you something." He saw something flash across his face. Not nice. Having fun. It could be both. In an instant, he reached for his radio. He said in the speaker, "We got a non-compliant driver here." It got stronger. Turn around. Her heart rate went up, but her face stayed blank. She spoke in a low but strong voice. "Officer, I need you to understand something. I am fully aware of what I am permitted to do. What you can't do, I know very well." What Briggs thought was wrong. His jaw tensed up. He yelled and grabbed her wrist. "You're under arrest." He tried to grab her, but Renee moved quickly and stepped back just enough to escape his grip. For what are they being held? Briggs took off his handcuffs. Due to blocking a police officer, she let out a sharp breath through her nose. That was his game. Her time in the service paid off. Beat stays the same, taking even breaths. She knew what she could do, either give in and fight this later, or fight back and risk things getting worse. She didn't want to become just another number. She turned slowly and carefully, putting her hands on the roof of her car. She liked how cool the metal felt against her hands. Briggs quickly pulled her arms behind her back and made the handcuffs way too tight before pushing her toward the police car. She said, "You don't know what you're doing." Briggs laughed and pushed her into the back seat. "I'm sure you know what I'm doing, lady." He didn't, though, not even close. She hurt her back on the hard plastic seat of the police car. Renee sat still, his wrists hurt from the cuffs. She took a deep breath. She was trapped when the door slammed shut behind her. Briggs strutted back to his car outside and muttered something into his radio. She took a quick look at the wall that separated her from the front seat. She could barely make out her face in the mirror, calm and collected. There was something else going on, though. She had been through military drills, high-stakes missions, and being questioned in other countries. But this was different. This man with a badge was high on power and thought no one could hurt him. Some time went by, then 5, then 10. She moved her hands around a little to check the cuffs, not loose enough. He had planned to do it. He slid in whistling as the door on the driver's side opened. He said something and pulled his seatbelt across his chest. "Let's go for a ride." She didn't answer. He put the car in drive and pulled off the side and back onto the road. The police car jerked forward, and the lights above it were still blinking. She could see the red and blue leaving marks on the road behind them in the side mirrors. After a moment, Briggs said, "You know, most people just don't say anything when I tell them to leave." Renee let out a sharp breath through her nose. Also, most police officers don't arrest people who question a traffic stop. He laughed and shook his head. "Lady, you must really believe that you are important." She used the glass to look at him. "I don't think so. I understand." That made him think for a second. As he flexed his fingers around the wheel, a flash of irritation broke through his cocky exterior, but he quickly covered it up. "You in the army?" he asked, and all of a sudden his tone changed. She didn't answer. "I knew what he meant," he said. "You seem to think you're better than the law." He laughed. "You probably thought that if you said that, I'd back off, right?" She didn't say anything, though. Berg snapped his tongue. He thought to himself, "Shame." He shook his head. "Things could have been different if you hadn't said anything." Her jaw got tight. What a fool they were. It was like she was to blame for what he did. The station, a short, grey brick building off the main road, could be seen ahead. The parking lot didn't have many cars in it. Things moved slowly late at night, and she seemed to be the only guest for now. Briggs pulled into a reserved spot near the front door, turned off the engine and looked at her through the wall. He said in a low voice, "Gotta say, I do love it when they make it easy." He slammed the door behind him and left the car before she could answer. After a second, her door opened. He said, "Let's go." She twisted her hands a little as she walked out the door. The cuffs hurt her. He hadn't made them any less tight. He led her inside, past a desk sergeant who looked bored, and into processing. She kept her head up. What was being held smelled like old coffee and sweat. Along the far wall was a metal bench, and just past it was a steel door that led to the cells. Briggs let go of her handcuffs just long enough to book her. Fingerprints, photos, and all that other stuff. From behind their desks, the cops barely looked up. They were just going through the motions. She had seen people act like this before. It was the kind of place where bad guys like Briggs could do well. After it was over, he grabbed her wrist again and led her to the rooms. "You believe you are smart, right?" He said something under his breath. She took a sideways look. "I do not need to think." His grip got stronger. She knew that made him mad. Briggs sneered and pushed her toward the cell. "Enjoy your stay." Before she fell, Renee caught herself. She turned around and watched as the metal bars closed between them. Briggs smiled from the other side and lightly tapped the bars with his fingers before leaving. The lock went into place with a click. She took a deep breath and sat down on the bench. Her feet hit the ground when the cold metal pressed through her jeans. It would only take one night. The cold, hard metal bench was awful for Briggs because he didn't know who he had just messed with. When Renee felt her shoulders getting stiff, she moved a little and rolled them over. The cell wasn't very big. It only had 4 walls, a weak light and a faint smell of germs and old sweat. She had slept in much worse places before, in spots where the fear wasn't just pain but real danger. It wasn't anything. She wasn't mad, though. She could hear the faint chatter of police officers at the front desk through the bars, the occasional moving around of papers, being hit by a coffee cup on a desk. She let out a slow, steady breath. Keep your breathing in check. Mind must be ruled. She had basic training for a long time before she joined the fleet. Then there were heavy steps. Briggs, before he even showed up, she knew it was him. He walked with the same cocky beat, as if he thought no one could hurt him. A second later, he showed up in front of the cell with his arms crossed over his chest. He had the same smirk on his face. Feeling good. She didn't answer. He took a step toward the bars and tilted his head. You wouldn't be here now if you had just gone along with it. She slowly smiled, and the corners of her lips turned up. Oh, I'm right where I should be. Briggs' grin broke for a split second. Something flashed in his eyes. Not nice, not knowing. He quickly put it over his head and laughed as he looked at the empty waiting area. Lady, no one is going to come get you tonight. He gave a shrug. I guess that means you will have some time to think about how you feel. Renee did nothing but watch him, not moved, not shook. Briggs leaned in a bit. He went on, dropping his voice. See, here's the thing. You and other people like you don't follow the rules. You think that being sure of yourself is all you need to stay out of danger. He was able to talk. Allow him to talk. It didn't matter, since he didn't know what was going to happen. Then, as if on cue, another police officer came in from the hallway. A younger man who was possibly in his late 20s and was wearing a standard uniform. He stopped with a clipboard in his hand a few feet away. Okay, Sergeant. There was a hint of doubt in the officer's words. We got a call. Briggs didn't even dare to look at him, and the officer paused and moved around on his feet. And this looks like something you should see. Briggs frowned and looked at Renee one last time before leaving. She took a seat and listened. The talk was kept quiet, but she caught some things. Something about a lawyer, a call from a bigger place. It was asked why she was being held. Briggs' voice got sterner and lower as he got mad. It was hard to tell what the younger officer said in answer, but it didn't seem to make him happy. Then I heard heavy footsteps again. Briggs slapped back hard on his jaw. He stood there with his hands clenched into fists. He no longer grinned. What in the world did you do? Renee put her arms on her knees and leaned forward. I did nothing. She turned her head a little. But people talk. Some of us also have friends in very high places. Briggs' face turned darker. She could see it now. That moment of awareness starting to set in, the change in power. He was no longer in charge. He stomped his feet, said something under his breath, and walked down the hall away. Renee let out a sigh. It won't be long now, and Briggs would feel bad about every choice he made that led him to this point when the truth came out. The narrow windows in the courtroom let in morning light that made long streaks on the polished floors. Inside, the air was clean. When you sat still for too long, that cold would settle deep in your bones. Renee sat down next to the defendant's table. Her shoulders were back and her eyes were alert. She was no longer handcuffed, not the orange jumpsuit. No cell for holding, just a navy blue jacket that fits well, a simple blouse and a strong presence. She wasn't by herself. Carla Whitman, her lawyer, was reading through a stack of papers next to her, barely looking up as more people came into the hall. The woman worked quickly and carefully. There are no useless steps. Don't make small talk. That was good for Renee. At the back of the chamber, the heavy wooden doors opened. Bruges came in. He still walked around with his shoulders straight and chin slightly raised, like he owned the room. But now there was a change. His steps were stiff. Something that hadn't been there before flickered in his face. He wasn't sure of himself as much. Renee caught his eye. He turned away. Okay. When the judge walked in, the room became quiet. Judge Alan Kirkland, an older guy with a tired look on his face, adjusted his glasses as he sat down. He didn't wait around. Okay. He sighed and looked over the case files. Let's do it. The prosecutor, a middle-aged guy with well-combed hair, spat out his words. Your Honor, we have reason to think that Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, the defendant, was detained illegally and without a good reason. Also, new information shows that Sergeant Daniel Briggs, the officer who made the arrest, has a history of bad behavior. There was a buzz in the room. Briggs moved in his seat and clenched his teeth. The judge looked at him through his glasses. Sergeant Briggs, could you speak to me? Briggs leaned in and cleared his throat. Your Honor, the offender refused to cooperate during a normal traffic stop. It was cut off by the lawyer, not cooperating. He turned around and took a piece of paper off the table. Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record shows that he had a successful military career, graduated from the Naval Academy, received multiple awards, and had no criminal record or outstanding citations. Even with all of this, you had to arrest her for a broken tail light because she was such a threat. He opened his mouth and then closed it. There was a long pause. The lawyer went on, looking through his papers. Also, an internal review of your arrest record shows that you have been involved in too many traffic stops involving black drivers in this area. There were more murmurs. Briggs' face turned darker. The judge sighed and put down his file. Sergeant, what I'm hearing makes me uncomfortable. He leaned back and crossed his arms. She fought back. A raised eyebrow was made by the lawyer. The video from the body cam shows otherwise. There was another sound wave in the room. Briggs became more defensive as he looked at the judge. I was doing what was expected of me. Judge Kirkland didn't believe it. He took a quick look at the collector. Let's watch the video. At the front of the courtroom, a screen went down. There was a video play. The girl didn't look up. She had been there. The way Briggs gave orders, her cool voice, the needless escalation, and his cocky way of tightening the cuffs. What a quiet room it was when the video was over. As Judge Kirkland leaned forward, he curled his fingers together. Sergeant Briggs, you broke the rules. You arrested someone without a warrant. And you didn't give all the information in your first comment. Briggs spoke up, but the judge wasn't done yet. There are no longer any charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson. His gavel hit the ground hard, and finally, I also highly advise that Sergeant Briggs' actions be looked into by his superiors. There was a snap like a rubber band in the room. Briggs looked like he had a gut punch. His face was red, and he had his hands squeezed together at his sides. Renee only let out a sigh, slowly in control. She was sure all the time. She looked at Briggs one last time as she stood there getting her things. They looked at each other. There were no words said. They didn't need to be. She didn't have to fight for her image this time. It was Briggs. Briggs stormed out of the courtroom, leaving behind heavy footsteps that could be heard down the clean halls. His face was tense. He clenched his teeth. He knew that people were looking at him. Besides the police, there were court staff and reporters who showed up after word of the case got around. He wasn't used to this. He was used to being in charge, to walk into a room and make people fear or respect you. But now, he felt like the power he had been using without thinking about it was leaving him. The worst part then came. Hey, Sergeant Briggs? A sharp voice could be heard over the noise in the hallway. He turned around. Chief Eldon Baker stood there with his arms crossed and no emotion on his face. It was well known in the police station that the older man had been a police officer for more than 30 years. What he said was true. Briggs stood up straight. "Sir?" Baker shocked him for a second. With a short nod, he then told Briggs to follow him into a private room. The chief's voice dropped as soon as the door shut. "Why the hell did you think that?" Briggs let out a sharp breath. "I had to do my job." "Your job?" Baker laughed and threw a file on the desk. With a loud thud, it hit the ground. "From here, it doesn't look like that. The video from the body cam. The history of arrests. You didn't even know who you were arresting. Briggs' nose got big. What is that connected to?" Baker leaned in. Everything. It was quiet, but his voice was clear. This wasn't just any woman. This was a very important Navy leader. "Do you think this will just go away?" Briggs turned his head away and clenched his teeth. "She treated people badly. She asked you a question," Baker said. "That's not a crime." Briggs laughed it off and shook his head. "You don't get it. People like that," the chief said, his face getting harder. "How do people like it, Briggs?" "Keep quiet." Briggs gulped and didn't say anything. Baker rubbed his forehead and sighed. "The DA is going through all of your cases from the last 5 years. You have been accused of racial stereotyping, and you can be sure that this department won't be leaving with you." Briggs could feel his stomach turn. "What does that mean?" Baker stood up straight. "It means you are being suspended right away. As of right now, the police are looking into it, and if they find what I think they will," he shook his head, "your job is over." Briggs felt like she had been hit in the gut by the words. His face was red. "This isn't true." Baker put out his hand. "Leave that line unfinished." His voice was cold. "Put your desk away. I would also hire a lawyer if I were you." As Briggs stood there with his hands on his sides, his world fell apart right in front of him, and he realized for the first time in his career that no one could beat him. Renti was in a quiet cafe across town, stirring her coffee while she looked through her phone. The story was already in the news. The video went around the world. Lieutenant Commander was taken without a reason. Officer is being looked into. It didn't surprise her. She knew how this was going as soon as she got out of her car that night. They were the kind of guys she had seen before. Self-centered, spoiled, and used to breaking the law to get what they want. He lost this time, though. Her phone rang. A message from her lawyer. Briggs has been put on leave. Could be charged. She slowly sipped her coffee. Okay. She took a quick look out the window at the city going by. There was still fighting, not for her, not for the people Briggs probably hurt before. But today was a good day. As Renee walked out of the cafe, the cool afternoon air smelled like fresh rain. She should have felt the weight of the last 24 hours on her shoulders. It didn't, though. She walked like she always did, sure of herself. Keep your head up and your steps steady. Her phone rang again. This time, it was a number she knew. She sighed. "Then you answered. Captain, First Lieutenant Commander." The voice she knew answered. "I think you know what's going on." "Yes, I have." A short pause. "Then, also, how do you feel?" Renee looked at herself in a shop window nearby. She didn't see any signs of losing. She stays calm the whole time. "It feels like I did just what I needed to do," she answered. The captain's voice got softer. "I thought you would say that." Stillness. "The Defense Department is interested in your story. Do not be shocked if they ask you to talk about it." Renee let out a breath through her nose. "I'm not sure if I want to be a story." "You're already there," the captain replied. "And what happened to you is a sign of something bigger, whether you like it or not." That was something she knew. That was something she had always known. Briggs wasn't the only one who did this. He was a part of a system that had let police officers like him work for years without being caught. It wasn't just about her. There may have been as many as hundreds of people who had been in her place but didn't have the power, the lawyers, or the words to fight back. Renee leaned against a streetlight and watched the cars go by. She said that this was not the first time something was like this. This isn't the last one either. The captain agreed, though, but this is the first time Briggs has had to deal with penalties. It's because you didn't give up. She closed her eyes for a second to think about what she had just heard. She didn't give up. Not after Briggs stopped her. Not when he tried to scare her. Not after the cuffs got tighter around her arms. She didn't even feel bad when she spent the night in jail because she knew the odds were against her. She didn't give up. She had now won. The captain shook his head. He added one more thing. The mayor's office may be calling you. Renee raised an eyebrow. Oh, it looks like they want to thank you for handling the problem so professionally and with class. She laughed. That's really funny. The captain laughed. Are you going to accept it? Renee gave it some thought. Then they shrugged. I'm going to think about it. The call was over, and she put her phone back in her pocket. Across the street, a mum walked with her little boy, and he had his small hand around hers. He was having fun with something, not worried, life-filled. She looked at them for a moment. The next group of people, yes, she had fought for herself. She had fought for him, though. There should be a world where guys like Briggs couldn't use their badges like weapons for every black boy and girl. She took a big breath in. Then she walked away, her steps firm and her goal clear, because she wasn't the only one in this fight. It was never there. When power is not checked, it is abused. The only way to change the system is to make it answer for what it does. Every day, people go through what Renee did. These are people who don't have any rank, ties, or proof to back them up. That's why you should speak up, for change to happen, not to keep quiet. Share this story if it made you think. Talk about it if it made you mad. It may have shown you how much work still needs to be done. Stay involved, because having real talks is the first step to making real change.